Hey, Dima here, and welcome to the third episode of the StateMachine tutorial. In the last episodes, we created our StateMachine base and implemented our first state. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, I'd really recommend you to check them out before jumping into that one. Alright, so in this episode we are gonna build the interaction state, which is just a little bit more than just creating a state. For the interaction state we need exactly two scripts, the state super action and state sub interact. Create them and open up the state super action. In here, get rid of the mono behavior and inherit from state manager, and also create the constructor here. Okay, and now open up the state sub interact and inherit from state super action. So any action we create in the future, like dodge or collect or anything similar, has to inherit from the state super action. So no action gets overwritten once they are called. So basically you cannot interact and dodge at the same time or collect something and speak to an NPC. Create the constructor and override the enter function, and in here we want to tell our player to reset the movement once we enter the state. Or like the velocity of our player, so we don't slide on the ground once we enter the state. So player.movement.velocity idle, and remember velocity idle resets our movement. So in there we are calling rigid body.velocity equals vector3.0. Let's quickly work on the detection of interactable objects. So go back to Unity and add the prefab. Under collision, create another empty game object and call it interact. Now open up the player collision script and let's create something that can detect our interactable objects. What we want is a sphere which detects multiple collider. For that we need to create, as we did in here, a header, the interact check, interact layer, interact radius, and the interact gizmos. And now the detection part. So public collider as an array and name it interact. And now the lambda expression and physics.overlap sphere and pass in the variables interact check.position, interact radius, and interact layer. And also don't forget to create the gizmos for that. And in here it's a little bit different than we used to do for the ground. Due to the collider array we created, we need to check if our collider has a length of bigger than 0. So if interact gizmos is true, then we need to check if interact.length is bigger than 0. And after that, just use the same code as you used for the ground detection. Alright, what we now need to do is to create an input for entering the interaction state, and for that open up the input actions and basically do the same as you did for the jump input. And for that create a new action right here and name it interact. Make sure the action type is set to button and initial state check is off, and now click on the no binding, select keyboard, select path, listen, and now press your key you want to interact with. I'm gonna go with E. Okay, and now do the same for the gamepad. So plus icon, add binding, select gamepad. Now press the button you want to interact with. I'm gonna go with the Y. And now don't forget to save the asset. Now let's open up the input processor and create a private float input interact and also a public getter for that. And also don't forget to create a function which you're gonna name public void process input interaction with a float value parameter. And set our this.input interact to the value. To receive and set the button value, we need to open up the input manager and create the input action here. So public void input interact input action.callback context, and basically do the same as you did in the input jump, but instead saying process input jump, use the process input interact and pass in our time value. Now let's work on the logic how we can actually enter the interact state. So think about what state you want to enter the interact state from. In my case, it's the super state ground, because I want to interact from the idle as well as the movement state. So open up the state super ground and in the update say if our player is grounded and our input interact is bigger than the actual time.time, and that's the new one here, if we are detecting any interactable collider. So player.collision.interact.length bigger than 0. And if all that is true, we want to tell our process input interact to set the value to 0, so we don't interact continuously. And then change the state to player.states.interact state. Ignore the error right here because we're actually missing the reference in our state collection, so open up the state collection script and just create the interact state as you did with other substates. So the first thing we need to do when adding a new input function is to assign it into the input action, our input system basically. So select the input game object, go to player input, events, general input, and assign it in here. So click on the plus, drag in our function holder, which is the input manager, and select the input manager and the interact function we just created. Now we need a layer for interactable objects, so on the layer, create a new layer and name it interactable. For testing, create a new 3D cube, reset the transform and place it where you can see that. If you want, you can add a rigid body to it. Well, let's actually do it and scale it a little bit up. And also set the layer to interactable. Now click on the collision game object and assign the interact game object in the interact check. Set the layer to interactable and enable the gizmos here. If you don't see the gizmos in your game view, you can enable it by clicking on gizmos right here. And now we can play with the value. I think 3 fits pretty well. And if you want, you can also reposition the interact object here. So everything that is in this red circle is getting checked for interactables. Alright, and now let's start the game and see what we've created here. As you can see, our circle becomes green as soon as we are in contact with an interactable object. And if we press our interact key, we immediately switch to the interact state. And we are actually stuck in there. The reason is pretty simple, it's just because we are not transitioning from that to any other state. And that's what we're gonna do now. So let's jump into our state sub interact script. And in here it's actually pretty simple. Create a float enter time and in the enter function assign the time.time to our enter time. So enter time equals time.time, just to know the time when we enter the state. So each time we enter the state, our time is different. It sounds so weird, but yeah. And now override the update function and simply say if time.time, so the actual current time is bigger than our enter time plus, and now choose a value or amount of seconds that you want to be in the interact state. So let's do 0.4 here, so we can easily see that we have been in the interaction state. And if that's true, just say StateMachine.change and now change to the idle state. So player.state.idle state. And now let's test it out quickly. Alright, so I'm in Unity, I'm in a game, and now I press the interaction key and yep, we are in the interaction state. Okay, so now we need to create some logics for our interactable objects. Here we're gonna use an interface. So let's create a folder called interface and a folder called NPC behavior. Create a script which you're gonna call, let's do NPC, and in the interface folder create iInteractable. The I stands for interface, so make sure to include that here. Open up the iInteractable script and replace class with interface and also delete the start and update function as well as the money behavior. So interfaces are actually very powerful, and for that I think I will create another video about that just to cover all the topics in there. And here just simply say public void interact and close the brackets. The function will be called on any game object that is interactable. So just follow along with that and you will understand in a second what is happening here. Open up our NPC script and next to the money behavior, because that one will sit on our game object that we just created, say comma iInteractable and get rid of start and update here. And now to get rid of the error, we need to implement our interface. You can write it out like public void interact or just use the help function. And also remove the exception handler. For testing purposes, just create a serialized field rigid body, RB, and in our interact function, just say rb.velocity plus equal vector3.up multiply with 10. So once we interact with that object, it will basically call the interact function and will execute the jump here. Now we need to do the last part. For that, open up the state sub interact script, and after velocity idle, we need to get our object that we want to interact with. Keep in mind that we already know that we can interact because otherwise we wouldn't be in that state here. So let's get the object that we want to interact with. The problem right now is when we create multiple interactable objects and we collide with 2 or more, we will interact with the first that entered our sphere. So we need to get the closest object here. We can use it for each here, but there is a much more elegant way to do that just by using the system.link. So why not use that? Using system.link. And now let's get the closest collider. So what is happening here is actually very interesting. We get exactly one collider, and that collider is the closest one of every collider that we are interacting with. So basically the closest collider in the array. And after that, just call the interact function. So closest collider.getComponent iInteractable interact. So keep in mind that we actually don't know what script our interactable object has. But in that case, we can just call the interface without even knowing if that's an NPC or like a storage or anything else. So we can just call the interact function. Alright, and now let's jump back into Unity and click on the cube game object and add component and search for NPC. There we go. And now just drag in the rigid body into the rigid body field. I'm gonna copy the cube multiple times here, so I think 3 is enough. And let's start the game. Alright, we can move, we can jump around and move actually while being in air. And now let's try to interact with the objects. So I'm pressing in direction now. As you can see, it works. Let's try the other one. It works. So everything works so fine. Here's an example of 3 different behaviors. So one is NPC, the one is storage, and the other one is like collect. So let's try the collect one. So if I interact with that, it disappears. This one, I think this one changed the color. Yeah. And that one just jumps. And all of them inherit from the same interface, the IInteractable. And also they have the same function, which is the interact function. Alright, so if you have any questions, feel free to use the comment section down below. And in the next episode, we'll work on animations and create our camera controls. See you in the next episode.